Now the next thing you need to understand about a custom interior map is you can make them at ground level if you want. And there's some reasons why you'd want to do that. For example, if you want to have a holodeck and you say you have a starship interior and you go into the holodeck and now you're outside on some fields or whatever, then obviously you want to have it on ground level because the holodeck will actually be what the map is. And I used this in Atlas Fair Part 2 for one of the holodeck simulations. You actually went outside and it was an alpine environment. But in this case, I'm going to put it at 1200 elevation, and the reason for that is because I want to have a star field outside. I want it to be a star base with actual windows. You can look out at the stars, and if you're going to do that, you have to put it at high elevation because otherwise you'll be able to see. I mean, obviously you don't want hills and stuff in the way. That's not going to make any sense. But if you have it too low, you pretty much want to make it as high as you possibly can, because if you have it too low, people can look down from the windows and they can actually see the ground. Now they pretty much can still do that no matter what, even at 1200 elevation, but it's not as obvious. So that's my recommendation. If you want a star field, go 1200. You could be asking why don't go 1500 or 2000, so whatever. The reason is because the elevation is capped at about 1350. If you try putting in 1500, it just ends up coming back down. So 1200 is a nice round number. You can probably get closer to the absolute maximum if you want to. Now, if you don't want to have windows, it's perfectly fine to have your interior level at a lower elevation. But I really wouldn't recommend putting it on ground level unless you actually want to access the ground, because once again it's going to constrain you with only being able to work on the flat part, because any hills and stuff are going to come up inside, and you obviously can't put your interior level in any areas where that's going to happen. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so let's get started making this custom interior. The first thing you want to do is you want to disable your snap to grid and snap to rotation if you haven't done so already, because they will make it basically impossible to make this level. Now the first step in making a custom interior level is placing the floor, because without a floor you don't have much to work with, especially if you're at 1200 elevation. You're just going to fall right through. So to make the floor, you use building block platforms, and I suggest using the 500 by 500s, but depending on how large your level is, you might want to use 100s. It doesn't really matter. But one trick you do want to use is you want to use the platforms from the buildings and not from the details. They're both identical, but the reason you want to use buildings is because the major limiting factor in making a custom interior is often the detail limit. You have a whole lot of rooms you have to put consoles and decorations in, and the detail limit is usually what you run into trouble with. Now, it may not be as much of a problem anymore after Season 6 because the detail limit got doubled, and I was actually able to go back to some of my previous maps and add more objects because I'd hit the limit on every single one of them before, and I wasn't really satisfied, but there's not much you can do when you have a half finished or not enough detail objects and the Foundry telling you that you can't place anymore. So the building limit is about 64, so that gives you about 64 more detail objects if you use these from the buildings instead of from the details. Now, on normal circumstances, I would say you would just make a square map for a starship deck or whatever you're making. I am going to make this an octagon because I'm trying to make a star base, so it's a little bit more complex. Maybe if you want to make a saucer section, you might also want to go with an octagon shape, but normally it's not really necessary. I'm going to take a break from making my map for a second to throw together a floor that might be more similar to what you are making, or what I recommend you make for your first attempt at a custom interior map. And that's basically just a square. Before I do that, though, I want to take a moment to cover an important aspect about these building block platforms. And that's that there's actually 3 different textures for them. Texture 01 is an orangish or tannish colored stone. Texture 02 is a grayish stone. And texture 03 is kind of a metal with little lines on it. Depending on what kind of map you're making, you could use any of these textures. But my recommendation is if you're making a starship or a star base or another high-tech environment, that you go with the metal texture, which is texture 03. And that's just because the stone textures, they're really primitive looking and seem quite out of place in a lot of those environments. But that's just my opinion, and depending on what your map is or what you like, you could use any of the textures. It doesn't change anything about how you would make the actual map. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this platform and I'm going to place it. And I'm going to set the Y relative to 0, and I'm going to set the elevation to 1200. Now it's very important that you set your y relative to 0, because if you have y set relative to terrain, you can basically only use the flat part of this clearing, and it looks pretty big, but the truth is at the edge here, if you look at my cursor on the screen, it starts to get kind of hilly there, and so that's already not usable, because with y relative to terrain, anytime the terrain changes, all the y values of the objects change relative to that, and that's great if you're trying to put things on the ground because you don't have to guess where it is, but if you're trying to make a flat custom interior map, it's basically absolute hell, and it's pretty much impossible to actually line things up. You'd have to preview just 1,000 times, and it would not be practical. So y relative to 0 has actually been a major improvement for the Foundry, because it used to be we could only use the flat part of the clearing, which really limited our size, because the clearing looks pretty big, but the truth is, if you're making a custom city, for example, this is actually a very small constrained space. And for a custom deck, it can still be a little bit constraining. So y relative to 0 has improved things a lot. Now, you might want to know how many of these platforms you should place. It really depends on how big your deck is going to be. It used to be before y relative to 0 and the ability to select multiple objects at once that was really important to plan your deck out and make sure you didn't start too close to the edge and then have to change things up later. But now you can pretty much just change it up as you go along, because say you started building your deck here and you went over this way, then you could easily just copy this platform and put another one over there to continue it if you wanted to. That did not used to be possible to do that, because with y relative to terrain this would not be a usable space. And another thing is, if you say you even want to change the layout of your deck later, you can just select multiple objects and drag them around. So it's not that important. You might want to just start with a couple different platforms to give yourself some room to expand, and then you can always just switch things up later. Alright, so I'm going to head back to my map here and show you how I'm doing. Now you saw there I just selected 3 platforms or 4 platforms and I just duplicated them. This is something that can save you a whole lot of time making these levels now with the Season 6 update. You have multi-select, you just select 4 or 5 objects, 10 objects, whatever, you duplicate them and you can move them all together. So that just saved me, a few minutes right there, just duplicating half the floor. Now I've placed all my platforms here, so that's a good start. But before I go ahead and preview, I'm going to rename these to be floor, north, northeast, east, and so on, so I can easily find them at a later time if I want to. I recommend doing this as you're going along, because if you did not rename things, then you'd end up with, building a block platform 500 by 503, number 5. What is that? Which one is it? It's not going to be easy to select it later if you need to do something with it. So that's an easy strategy to save yourself some time in the long run, even though it takes a little bit of time right now to do it. Okay, so I put all these platforms at 1200 elevation. They're all exactly at the same elevation. And now I'm going to skip ahead to where I load the map, because I'm going to show you a problem that you're going to encounter and how to fix it. So you can see there's a lot of texture fighting between the different platforms, which keeps changing as you move around, which obviously isn't acceptable. So the reason this is happening is because all the platforms are set to the same elevation. Anytime you have platforms that are set to the exact same elevation, you're going to have texture fighting, and that's something that you don't want. What you want to do is you want to make sure that each platform is at a slightly different elevation, and the way you accomplish that is by adding 0.001 to every platform that's overlapping. So, for example, with 2 platforms, you'd set one to 1200 and one to 1200.001. Or alternatively, you can decrease the elevation by 0.001. So you'd have one at 1200 and the other one at 1199.999. You have to do this for every platform you add. You can't have any of the platforms that are overlapping have the exact same Y value. And so that means if you have 4 platforms, you might have to have one at 1200.002, 0.003, and so on. Or alternatively, 1199.998, 0.997, and so on. It's not really that hard, you just have to make sure that none of them have the exact same Y values. So I adjusted the Y values on my map, and you can now see that everything's working properly. There isn't any more texture fighting, everything looks good, and we're ready to move on to the next stage of making this map. If you're making your map as you're watching this, now might be a good time to pause and make sure your floor is in and doesn't have any texture fighting issues before moving on to the next part.